I'm going to start out just by telling you a little bit about how this kind of came about and why this topic is of interest to all of us. I have to say that over the course of many, many years teaching up at Columbia University, one of the things that I always talk about is the awesome responsibility that producers have that kind of never ends. That, where like the movies that you make sort of follow you around for the rest of your lives. And so, part of the point that I'm trying to make is about the fact that you really have to pay attention to the details when you're setting things up and, getting things into the marketplace and all that kind of stuff. So it came as a complete shock to me. I suddenly discovered that movies that I produced were gone, that they were not available anywhere, that it was a mystery as to where the rights were held. It was a mystery in terms of where the materials were held. And I found that there were a lot of other filmmakers, particularly filmmakers who made films in the 80s and 90s, who ended up in the same boat. Part of it is because of the fact that the way films were financed in those days. There were a lot of different entities that came together, and it was never clear where the copyright was ending up, and with all these interlocking deals, and then companies get sold to other companies, and companies go out of business, and then labs went out of business, and things, so a lot of crazy stuff that creates this incredible mystery. And we ended up, myself and a bunch of other filmmakers, including Sue Bodine, who's on our board as well, started an organization called Missing Movies. And it's an educational initiative to make sure that we can help filmmakers find their movies if they're missing. But more importantly, and the reason why we're here today, is to try to help filmmakers to prevent this from happening to their films that they're making now. And to some extent, there are things that make it a little easier now because we're all dealing in the digital realm as opposed to having this very expensive, stuff, 35 millimeter film, and et cetera. But in any case, that's why we're here. We're going to kick things off by showing you a little trailer that will reinforce, particularly in the documentary world, which is specifically why we're here, the number of movies that you may not realize have kind of disappeared.
About a year ago, I had a call from my mother. She was wondering if I'd be interested in a lot of old films that she had stored in a shed at the bottom of her garden.
I think I've spent my life trying to find both identities, the country of my birth and my adopted country, the United States of America.
I really don't know where any piece of my life really belongs.
What I leave behind has a life of its own. I've said this about poetry. I've said it about children. Well, in a sense, I'm saying it about the very artifact of who I have been.
To kick things off, I'm going to ask Sue Bodine, who, those of you who don't know her, she's a partner at the law firm of CDAS, and they're the sponsors, by the way, of today's panel. And a longtime champion of independent film. She's handled the financing and distribution and all the various legal things for so many great independent filmmakers. And I'm pleased that she's on the board of Missing Movies. What Sue's going to do is walk us through a little piece of some information that we've assembled to tell you how important it is to be paying attention to certain things. We have these brochures that we created that have a lot of information in them that you could pick up at the end of the panel. But Sue's going to walk us through just a little piece of this.
So just as a quick little background, yes, I've been working in this independent film business world, on the legal side for many decades. And it certainly, as Ira was saying, and how surprised he was to find for himself that even though he was expert in all these things, that films that he had worked on and knew and whatever had quote unquote gone missing. And that's kind of what happened with me too, in terms of getting involved in this organization, where I started the same clients that I helped make their movies in 1995 and 96, we're now coming back and saying, okay, the big distribution deals are over, so what, do I get my movie back? Where is it? What's going on? And realizing that in the heat of the moment of putting your films together, and I think this is true of docs as well as features. I know features has a certain kind of like, oh my God, you got to start today and it's going to be over, and the cast and everything. But docs have their own rhythm of how they get made, and oftentimes it takes a long time over time to get a docs financing together. And I would imagine that a lot of you all have experienced similar things to some of the filmmakers that helped propel me to kind of help try to figure out what to do about this. And as Ira said, what we want to do, part of what the mission for us right now is to educate filmmakers about what they can do ahead of time, or hopefully to prevent. It's one of those, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure situations. We're still in the pound of cure place for the most part, okay? As you can see from the little clip, I mean, there are just tons of movies out there that, need help, okay? Or if the filmmakers might need help doing that. It's not Missing Movies' mission, by the way, to actually go and find these movies and bring them back. Okay, that's what we are. We will be a resource for filmmakers to help them figure out how to do that, all right? And one of the things that I'll mention, plug, even though we're not there yet, but we're starting, just starting an initiative to do a legal referral service for filmmakers, sometimes on a pro bono basis, depending on what the situation is, to match make filmmakers who need and want to find their movies again and try to get them back in circulation with lawyers, some of who may not be expert in it, but a lot of it is just detective work, okay? It's just pursuing leads and following up, and then when you get to the final stages, obviously there's legal work to be done as well. So we decided that, there's one thing that would really, really help a lot, I think, is if in the initial legal work being done for the financing of a film, that there was some obligation on the part of the financier / producer, whoever is actually going to be owning the film, to keep the filmmaker notified of who owns the film, where is the film, what's going on with the film. And obviously that's going to be an issue for financiers and producers. It's an obligation that we're suggesting they take on that they certainly don't have now. But they do have, and there's so many ways that films are owned and so forth. And as you know, I mean, sometimes you might raise the money yourself, keep all the rights yourself. That's wonderful. You'll have issues of record keeping and so forth, but you'll know where your film is, okay? But for many filmmakers, they don't end up owning the film. It's owned by either one financier, or as I said, perhaps a group, or maybe it's commissioned. You may be commissioned by a public television station to create something that there is really, in a sense, going to be a work for hire, but it's still your movie, okay? And whether you actually own the rights or not. So the desire for you to find a film that you've made or that you would like to bring back into circulation doesn't necessarily depend on you being the absolute owner of the film. Of course, it will help if you are, okay? But these things that we're talking about now are ways for you to kind of keep track of what's happening with your film. So we came up with a list of, which is in the brochure that Ira mentioned, of provisions, contract provisions, that we think, that we want to promote for filmmakers to ask for when they are doing their contracts for making their films, recognizing that this is going to be a struggle and a long story. Okay, it's not something that is going to become customary in a second, but I think if it's a big group effort that everybody is sort of trying to do this, and this is part of what we're doing, is spreading the word, to just at least ask, bring it up, talk about it with whoever it is that's either representing you or the people who are putting up the money. I've had one success of with a client of mine, not a documentarian, but a TV artist, a writer and director, to get into their contract these provisions. Okay, so that was like, yay, we got one. Now we only have 5 gazillion more. But we're also talking with one of our other board members, Mary Herron, is on the DGA Council of Independent Filmmakers, and has been bringing it to their attention. And we're going to really try to get the DGA to kind of pay attention to this issue, and to promote also putting these kinds of contract provisions in the DGA basic agreement. I mean, the truth of the matter is, it's only notification obligations. It's not, it wouldn't be costing anybody anything. It wouldn't be, we're not asking for extra money, nor not asking for, detailed reporting of accounting. As you well know, you're supposed to be getting accounted to by your distributors for royalties and expenses, and sometimes they do and sometimes they don't, okay? And you have to pursue that. But you have the contractual right to these things, and it's important that you do have that. And it gives you kind of that leg to stand on to make demands of the distributors. And this would be much of a lesser burden, but it would still be an obligation of the distributor or the owner of the film. And that would be, so the things that we're talking about are, one, notification of who owns the movie, okay, who owns the copyright, and a notification to the filmmaker if and when that changes hands, and contact information for whoever the owner is going to be, whoever the copyright owner is going to be. I would also like to see copies of distribution agreements being made to filmmakers, but I'm not putting that on tier 1, okay? So let's just deal with the real first thing, just notice, okay? As you probably know, in most contracts for distribution and so forth, there's a section called notices that says, this is, if there's any notices that have to be sent out, this is who has to get them and where they have to go. And really, that's what we're saying here, is we put the filmmaker in that section as getting this information of what the entity that owns the copyright, and the contact information, and if and when that changes hands, that information will go also to the filmmaker. The other thing that we would be asking for is, and this is again depending on the situation, is the deliverables, the actual material. Of course, digitally now things are quite different, but it's still possible to lose things, okay? Things get degraded. I'm not the one to talk about the preservation and archiving part of it, because I don't understand most of it. I don't know whether someone's going to talk about, okay, Shola will talk about that, okay? But that's very important too, and it can take a lot of time and energy and effort and money, okay, to bring something physically back to where it can be actually shown, okay? So that's the second thing would be at somebody, whether it's the producer, whoever's making delivery to the distributor, needs to provide that delivery material, not the material itself, but a list, the delivery schedule, so we know exactly what was delivered and to who, okay? And then also, if things are at a lab, what that lab is, where it is, what the contact information is, and if stuff is moved from one lab to another, then notice should be made to the filmmaker. So those are the two big items that we're really talking about. The other thing would be the copy, and this is where I guess we'll talk about the LTOs, all right? To actually have made physical copies, at least 3, we would think, That should be, is that what we're saying?
Well, at least one.
At least one, okay, all right, okay. That, that would have everything on it, right? It would be not just the film, but would also have the contracts on it and so forth and so on, so that you have a complete record. Now, a lot of this is, as I said, is gonna be not easy to get, okay? It also does going to require a level of record keeping on the part of the filmmakers that a lot of filmmakers are not used to, okay? I mean, I certainly know from my experience, and as I said, I'm from old school, where when you start talking about these kinds of things with clients, they're like, there's a bunch of boxes in the basement. I don't really know what's in them, okay? And the bottom kind of got flooded, but I think we might have something in there, and I think that those days are over, which is good, and that, filmmakers today are much more able and savvy to keep their records, so that, but they would really, with something like this, that would mean when you get these notices, okay, if you get notices, that you know what to do with them and keep them and so forth, and that when licenses expire, so that you're in a situation that if you sold a film to a distributor for 20 years, that you know when that 20 years is up, and you know what the distributor is, and if the distributor is still in existence or not, or where the film went. Because a lot of these companies are small distribution companies that go out of business, okay? So those are the very primary things, very simple, okay, things that we are advocating for filmmakers to put, and we have, I think, language even that we are suggesting in the brochure that, it's not legal advice. I'm not acting as your attorneys up here, but I just something that I think that is worth considering, and when you have the opportunity the next time, you have that opportunity to put to do a contract that is going to be for your services as a filmmaker, and it could be a producer too. Okay, it doesn't have to be the director if that's the way that things are structured internally, but it has to be a principle on the film. I mean, this is not something that somebody incidental to the movie would be able to get, but certainly the director and possibly the producer, depending on the situation, and certainly with docs, that could be true. So that's my little speech about that. We can talk more about it later, and you can get the brochure, take a look at it, and even if it's just an idea right now that you kind of rumbles around, and you think of it in passing next time you're going to make a movie, as I said first, if you are so fortunate that you are able to actually keep all the rights yourself from the beginning, okay, then obviously putting this doesn't have the same need, but hopefully you will be entering into a distribution for that film, and that it's that contract that even if you're not actually passing the copyright to the distributor, okay, you're licensing it to a distributor for, let's say, 10 years, it's during the term of that license, that distributor should have these obligations to keep you informed.
Assuming that we have time at the end, I can fill you in on something that I'm working on right now that's a complete nightmare that actually speaks to what Sue was just talking about. And just another quick aside, which is that one of Sue's clients, John Sayles, his partner and producer, Maggie Renzi, was in touch with me a couple of weeks ago, and she showed me a spreadsheet that she put together that required the help of, I can't even imagine how many interns researching to literally list every film in John's body of work, which is considerable, and who has licensed it, every single license that's ever been done on them, when they expire, who the licensee was, all that stuff. I looked at it and I took a deep breath and realized how inadequate everything I've ever done in my life has been, because that's exactly what you need.
Well, that's what I'm saying, is it does raise the bar in terms of...
And the more prolific you are, the worse it is on a certain level. So to move things forward, I'd like to show our next clip as an introduction to our next speaker, Susan Margolin. Susan was has been in the documentary world for a very long time. First as a distributor with New Video and Docurama, and then now she's a producer of documentaries. And this is a trailer for Susan's latest movie.
I'm very self-conscious right now because I want to say something perfect and poetic and beautiful, and I just know that this picture.
Hey, I'm walking here. I'm walking here.
He didn't make the movie to crusade about anything at all. He made the movie because he saw something in the culture that was great to take pictures of. Nobody had seen those images and those midnight cowboys on 42nd Street.
Talking at me. I don't hear a word they're saying.
It was the very first movie that I ever saw. It was a picture of New York that really looked like New York. It didn't look like Easter Parade and Judy Garland was going to come down singing. It looked as scuzzy and dirty as any other part of New York.
He was fascinated by America, by New York, by the drama of urban America.
No matter what Joe Buck's particular delusions might be, the cowboy-themed hustler is a very, very gay thing.
The winner is Midnight Cowboy.
I'm not even sure why it got an X.
If I'm going to America to make a movie, this is the movie I'd like to make.
It managed to express the zeitgeist. It expressed its time by being of its time, because nobody ever really knows their own time. So when people express their own time, it's generally by accident.
So before we actually move on to talking with Susan, this would be a proper moment to take a moment to just reflect on the passing of our dear friend Nancy Bursky, who this was her final movie. So, all right. Susan, as a former distributor, I feel like you're recovering distributor. Yes. Your perspective on the kinds of traps that you've seen filmmakers fall into, and the sorts of complaints that you've gotten from filmmakers now that you're in that world, even among films that you acquired for Docurama or whatever. If you could just talk a little bit about that and give us your wisdom.
Absolutely.
You should use a microphone too.
Yeah. It's so interesting, looking at things from the producer's perspective now, over the past 7 years versus, my distribution world for 25 years. I have had so many filmmakers reach out to me over the past 7 years since I left the company that I had sold my company to, a company called Cinedigm, now Cineverse, talking about changing names and changing ownership and such. Actually, just recently I got a call from Nick Gottlieb about a film, two films made by Mackie Alston, Family Name and Questioning Faith. And he was saying that he had heard that the film was still available for distribution, though the agreement had ended in 2015. So now we're 8 years later. And could I connect him with someone at Cinedigm? And so that sort of he went down that rabbit hole, and he did connect with people at Cinedigm, and indeed the film had been available on digital platforms in the in those intervening years. So he was able to, receive some royalties for, monies that were due. And from, Cinedigm's point of view, they were happy because they no longer had contact information for the filmmaker. And this happens, so often because, we're all, as producers, as directors, as filmmakers, running around, thinking about finishing our films, launching them, and then we're on to the next film. So, this is really a very common thing. And if only, would Maggie Renzi do that for all of us, do you think? I mean, create that.
Maybe she'll teach us how to do it.
Gorgeous spreadsheet. But, I think that it is really, really important to have some, even if it's just a simple Google Sheet, which is what I keep, a simple spreadsheet, with the film and the distributor, the international sales rep, the international sales licensing deals with ideally expiration dates and license fees. If you can, sometimes it's hard to get this information, but to the extent that you can. And then what I try to do is to have like an annual checkup. Like I think about going to the doctor, so my films also have to have that annual checkup where I'm updating the information so that 8 years don't go by and I'm suddenly don't have a contact at the sales rep and or at the distribution company, because things change and companies change hands, and so that kind of thing is important. Maybe it is an intern that helps you with this, because it does take time, and
it takes a lot of digging because that a lot of the information is just not generally available.
Yeah. The other thing that Nick told me when we did a follow-up call about family names and questioning faith was that the entity that had licensed the film to Cinedigm in the first place no longer existed. So there had to be an assignation of rights, and they had to reach out to all of the parties in that rights holding company, that LLC, and then get permission to have royalties go to Mackie Alston directly. So that's, do you want to talk about it?
Well, I was just going to say that's sort of exactly what we're saying, and that's where the kind of the rubber hits the road in terms of you doing the digging first, the detective work that it takes to get to the answer, which is not necessarily legal work. I will say that the trades are usually a pretty good source of information, because they do make a lot of announcements about companies merging or going out of business or going bankrupt or changing hands. So if you do a search of some of the archives of Variety and that kind of thing, you can come, not always, but you can find out who the successor from a particular company might be. And then of course, as you're saying, Susan, when you get to the point where you actually find out what's going on, and hopefully you have some cooperation from the distributor, that's when the lawyers kind of really do jump in and start to put together the paperwork that's necessary to bring it back to, to make everything current. But I would say that that experience you are describing is a pretty good success story.
It is. They actually, received, they found it, they spoke to a human.
That's always
that is, a huge thing to be able to reach a human. And they got the paperwork and they got a, proper accounting. The next step was interesting too, which is that they were offered a new contract. And the new contract had new terms. which, they needed to, kind of sort through and think about the implications and, think about, wow, do I really want to sign up for, the next 7 or, 10 years? And what are the other options that are available to me? And there just isn't a lot of information about, companies that will take on what are called catalog titles, which are, titles that have been out in distribution. So is that something, Missing Movies, is that something that you're thinking about at all?
Yeah, one of the problems that we run into, or that a lot of filmmakers run into, for which at the moment there is no solution to, but it's something that we're definitely giving a lot of thought to, is films that are in limbo because there's considered to be no interest on the part of the people who could potentially monetize them. So the people, as you know, catalog titles, if you talk to most distributors these days, they're not thinking there's a lot of money to be made off of those films. They're only interested in what's new, what's hot, whatever. So the question then becomes, how can you create interest on the part of, and we'll get to this with Shola, about the cultural significance of this stuff and keeping it alive for reasons other than just the fact that it might be profitable. So that is part of what we're talking about.
I would just say that there is a small handful of companies that that are interested in older titles and they have to be special. They're not going to just do every movie that happens to be 20 years old. But and that is something that you can do. Like I have a situation right now where the film is owned by public television, okay, and they're not going to give up the ownership of it. They don't really have any way of necessarily distributing it themselves. But we know that Criterion, which is a company that is very much involved in this kind of thing, is very interested in distributing this title. So we're trying to basically be a matchmaker, okay, between the public, the owner. We're not trying to own the movie, get the rights back to own the movie. We know we won't. But for the filmmaker, they'll be happy if it's out, if it's being shown on Criterion Channel, or it's going to get a good, good release in some way. So that's another scenario that can happen where you aren't necessarily entering into a contract for a new thing, but you're making the distributor who has it might not have any interest. But if you say, look, these people are interested and they'll pay a little something, and this is really a cultural film that is of importance, you can find people that you'll find lots of people who don't care, okay, but you'll find one or two that do. So I would say that's an example too.
Yeah. There are just a couple of things also that they had to consider. One is if they shifted to a new distributor, they would have new costs of redelivery, which can be quite expensive. So if you're thinking about, maybe the royalties that you might receive over the next term, and maybe it's only in the 5 figures, most likely, and your redelivery costs are exceed that, it's really a quandary.
Right.
And I'm hoping, and I'm gonna talk to you about this afterwards, but maybe there could be a fund to kind of help filmmakers with taking on these kinds of costs.
Someday.
You're not funding it personally, are you?
My credit limit is not that high. So just to move things along, because I want to get everybody involved, and then we'll start, asking questions from the audience. I'd like to turn to Shola Lynch, who is, that is your microphone, yes. And Shola Lynch is a director, producer, and curator. And her story is more of a happy story. not without its struggles, but why don't we kick things off by showing the trailer for Chisholm 72, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Philosophy professor Angela Davis admitted that she is a member of the Communist Party.
Hoover put her on the top 10. Everybody had a file on her.
Her first lecture drew 2,000 students.
Angela's education is now being put into practice.
Angela Davis purchased 4 guns.
There is a conspiracy in the land. It's a conspiracy to wipe out the black community as a whole.
Well, I think she's trying to overthrow our system of government, and she admits that.
The actions of the FBI in apprehending Angela Davis, a rather remarkable story.
A U.S. District Court judge set bail at $100,000.
She knows that the movement to free all political prisoners is growing every day.
This entire incident was a deliberate provocation.
They wanted to break me. They wanted me to respond.
There was enormous feeling for Angela everywhere in the world.
We know that she is innocent.
We want to tell that Pharaoh in Washington to let Angela Davis go free.
What they're doing to her is an exaggerated form of what happens every day to black people in this country.
What does it mean to be a criminal in this society?
They are not going to kill her. They're not going to imprison her. We're going to free her. We're going to win her freedom.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about your adventures in this world that we're talking about?
Sure. So I think it's really important to realize the kind of film you're making. First of all, I make archivally based films, and that means I have to license the footage. If you are a verite maker, it is you got to make sure you get all your releases. You got to have your Bible together. But related to archivally based films, I think it's very important to remember that if you have the privilege to interview somebody who is a cultural icon like Angela Davis, or my first film was on Shirley Chisholm and her run for president in 1972. And when I made that film, nobody believed a black person would ever be president. Yeah, I'm not kidding. In 2000 is when I was grant writing for it, and people thought it was so cute. They were like, this young woman wants to make her first film about this woman who ran for president in 1972. How cute. And I was like, yeah, write checks. Right? But I had learned, working with Ken Burns for a very long time. Gosh, how many years? 5 or 6 years, which was my school, my film school in a way. And I know people like to get grumpy over Ken Burns and the way he sees the world, but it is true to who he is, and that is his way of telling stories. And it was an incredibly magnetic experience to be around somebody who has a vision, whether you agree with everything or not, and to see them execute it, both in terms of content, right? Slow pans, whatever, style, but also how it worked in terms of the business, right? So when I set off to make my first film on Shirley Chisholm, I didn't know I could be a filmmaker, and I got into Sundance and all of that, but I was sure about one thing. Every piece of footage would be licensed for the life of the project, if I could afford it. Why do that? Because 10 years goes by really fast, and then you lose control of your story, and your story may still have cultural relevance. And so to negotiate those prices really early, to keep track of who the contact folks are and those legal contracts, along with all of your releases, this is your Bible. Same with, and it premiered at POV, and PBS owned the rights for 10 years. And then all of a sudden I had the rights back. And I was like, wow, this is great. And then BET came along and they wanted to show it ad nauseum for 2 or 3 years. They wrote me a 6-figure check to be able to show it, but I could say yes because I had cleared all the rights for the life of the project. And I would say the same for Free Angela. We came out at Toronto in 2012 and had a gala presentation, which for a historical documentary is unbelievable. Red carpet, all of that, etc. I wore black as usual. And the distributor was Lionsgate, and I thought, oh my gosh, this film is going to be tied up for the next 10 years. So my husband was like, yeah, 10 years is going to go by really fast. I was like, whatever. So he set, on his phone, he set a timer. And it went off recently. But, so it's funny, right? It's funny, but it's not. And now I have to go back to my lawyer to make sure that I get my film back, because when you tell stories that have cultural relevance, the value is not just the first release. The value is that the film is available. And I can't tell you, I get chills when, you know, it's Black History Month and Women's History Month and whatever, and through Sundance, I kind of self-distributed Chisholm, so it's on Amazon, it's on iTunes, and I have middle schoolers sending me emails asking to interview me because I met Shirley Chisholm and how awesome that is. And, you know, they're winning state awards. Oh my gosh. Right? And so we are their gateway into this moment in time that we have spent years thinking about and crafting. And so to kind of fast forward to the other work that I do is I run a film, a special collection at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. So I handle all the film and audio, and we collect filmmakers collections and, you know, cultural figures collections, etc. Blah blah blah. We have the William Greaves collection, you know, and I'm trying to unhide this. And your films continue to have value if you know the legal status, and then it becomes an archive, and your work as a maker becomes your oeuvre, and that has value. And sometimes towards the end of your life, as you're thinking about retirement, you can deposit that material in an institution like the Schomburg, or even sell it to your alma mater. You know, that there are options. And every little bit along the way counts when you're a maker. So I continue to make present day films, but I get asked to show and speak around Chisholm 72 or around Free Angela. So I always make sure in my contracts to have a non-exclusive right to exhibit your work. It's really simple that people usually, but it means then you can make money speaking about your work, and you come and you show your film, and that's always a help. So there are all of these little ways. So I, as a filmmaker now, want to explore the non-exclusive right to distribute your film for cases where the companies go defunct, right, because you're still interested in 10 years, even if
they're not there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so how do we work to find the language that isn't too scary to be able to control your filmic destiny?
I mean,
back right to what we're talking about, exactly.
Yeah, I have to say, I got that clause in a recent film that I licensed, where I have the non-exclusive rights. And the way the language that we used was just that it had to be with personal appearance.
Right.
But that's okay. Yeah. I'm willing.
I've seen them where they actually say that that's okay, but that the screening fee goes to them, and you can keep the personal speaking fee.
Yeah, but the screening fee is free.
Right.
It's all speaking fee.
It's all very,
yeah,
smoke and mirrors.
And hopefully you'll also have a clause that gives you the rights back if the company does go out of business.
Yeah, but those are often not enforceable.
But I do want to say one other thing. I think it's incredibly important to keep copies of the work that you make. And it sounds so like, of course I would keep copies. But you know how many filmmakers are like, yeah, I don't know where that film is anymore. I don't know where this, and because that is your calling card, that is your resume, that is your curriculum vitae, right? They say in academia. Like, it's really important for you to at least have a copy, because what? Possession is 5/10 of the law or something like that. 9/10, right, there we go. 9/10 of the law. So if you can't find out who it actually owns it, you can assume ownership and let them come to you.
Nancy's going to tell you about that.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's a great transition into.
There's also that other saying, is that better to ask forgiveness and permission?
I live for that thing.
So this is Nancy Wolff, who's also a partner at CDAS, our sponsoring law firm. And Nancy, that was a great transition into you talking about there's two issues that are kind of technical, but I think are worth bringing up in the context of this discussion, one of which has to do with orphan works, and the other of which has to be the right of termination. So if you can give us a little bit of that kind of information, that'd be helpful.
I'll start with an orphan works, because that might not put everyone to sleep as quick as termination. But anyway, yeah, it's a pleasure working with Sue and a lot of her clients, and my expertise is really in a lot of rights issues. I know a lot about copyright and have represented many of the companies that actually license content to documentary filmmakers. So I'm usually the one when Sue will do all the distribution and paperwork, and then I'll review the film and decide whether something can be released either because it's an orphan work, or it's under fair use, or it's de minimis, or the risk is just very low. But orphan work is an interesting word. It really means that it's very likely that someone owns it, and you, one, either know who owns it but you can't find them, or two, have no idea who owns it. And actually the Copyright Office did a study in the mid-2000s and decided it would really be a benefit to the public if you could use orphan works under copyright and have no liability, except if someone appeared and you had done your due diligence. The remedy would essentially be a license fee, and no one could get an injunction and stop your work. And it was all wonderful, except for the fact that most photographers and visual artists, their works never get credit. Like if you do a movie, there's a credit at the end of your movie. You write a book, you get your name attached to it. You do an album, song, but the photographers and it was like their works get sent out to the world as orphans. And so that really is what prevented real legislation on orphan works. It did trigger the looking into whether there should be a copyright small claims court, but we ended up never getting orphan works legislation. So what it really comes down to is a risk analysis. It's like you do your due diligence to try to find anyone who could own whatever you want. And in bankruptcy, do the assets go to someone? Or if something's owned, often films are owned by a wholly owned corporation that was basically formed to make that film. Mm-hmm. But then if an entity doesn't pay the state their annual taxes every year, they get automatically dissolved at some point. And so then there is no company to trace, and then you have to try to find an owner. Is that owner alive? Or is it only, how many owners were they? If the owner's not alive, then you have to figure, do they have any heirs? This is not a story about an orphan work of the film itself, but I worked with John Maloof, who made a documentary film about all his efforts he made to try to find an heir for this unknown photographer, Vivian Meyer, who was a nanny, never showed any of her work. He bought everything at an auction because her work was kept in storage and stopped paying the storage. And by the time he unboxed everything and discovered that these are really great photos, she had passed away. He had 4 genealogists in US and in France trying to find an heir. She wasn't married. There might have or not have been a brother. The parents weren't alive. The family had come from Europe. She found a first cousin, something removed in France near the Alps, and he thought he had paid day there because they had pictures of her. They knew who she was, so he got a quick claim. And all that was great until some other photographer decided that he was going to stand in the shoes of the heir and register to be the executor of the estate in Cook County, Illinois. That woke up Cook County, Illinois. Administrators are like, we're not gonna let this guy, we're gonna be the administrator. So then John and his gallery and everyone started getting these, litigation hold letters, we're gonna sue you. It's the first time I've ever heard, even the Copyright Office had never heard of a county standing in the shoes of heirs when no heirs could be found. And we spent a year making a deal with Cook County so that they could continue to sell prints, and we made sure that they allowed the film to continue and that we could do a derivative, like if ever wanted to make a feature instead of a documentary. But that's just the example of someone who went to great laboring efforts to do the right thing, and still something came up. But when it comes to films, I don't know if you want to distribute your own film and you have it and you're not sure if anyone else owns it, if there's issues with reps and warranties in distribution agreements. I mean, one way of handling it could be just not make the reps and warranties and always be a quick claim and just agree to indemnify. If someone comes in and maybe hopefully they either have money or some insurance, and maybe if someone will take care of it, will do that.
Well, I've done that in particular instances where we've used filmmaker indemnifications.
Yes.
And again, it comes down to a risk analysis.
Right.
So if the distributor or whoever is going to be showing the film, feels that it's really, really risky, then they're not going to allow that really. But in this case, they did. Okay, and they said okay, and these were music license issues for the most part. So it was a question of whether that's another thing that you need to do is license all the music that you're going to use in your films and have those licenses be in perpetuity and worldwide and all that stuff, which you probably know now. But these old movies didn't all have that by any means. So that's a risk that I'm going to actually be exploring soon. Okay, we've done a lot of work on the music rights for this particular film. We know what we have, we know what we don't have. We're going to present it to the distributor that's interested, and then they're going to make the decision about whether they feel that that's a risk that they're not going to take the risk. The question is going to be what you're saying.
Right.
Are they going to be comfortable with the filmmaker indemnification?
Right.
And sometimes I've even seen where there's like a slush fund, where you take the money that instead of paying the filmmaker or something in advance, which wouldn't be that much anyway, and you take that money and you put it in an escrow for a certain number, for 2 years or something, and or 3 years, and if nobody comes out after that,
right,
you can release it. So it's in a way it comes down to a commercial transaction.
It is, and there's a statute of limitations in copyright that's 3 years. Of course, some federal court is made up of all these different districts, and things get interpreted in circuits one way and another. And the Supreme Court has actually now taken up a question of something called the discovery rule, which it's sort of a way that in many parts of the country you can have claims that are years and years old because the copyright owner didn't know, which is in many ways unfair because no one has any documents left anymore. But so we might get an answer on that. So that would be helpful. So if you could keep something in escrow for 3 years, particularly if we get some good, clear answers eventually, maybe from the Supreme Court.
Go do it.
We'll try it. But the industry has changed with respect to the types of materials that can be included in films. There was a time where if you couldn't get a license, and I represent a lot of companies that have a lot of archival clips, you don't know who owns it. But you also know it's not very risky because, one, if you can't even bring a claim after certain Supreme Court decisions unless you have a copyright registration. So a lot of older archival material that's not professional, that may be in a lot of historical societies and everywhere, no one is going to have registered. And it's very difficult to get an injunction based on a small clip. The courts aren't doing that. So the worst thing that could mostly happen with these small pieces of clips within a film is a license fee. And so the insurance companies have been much more comfortable having lawyers do reviews and say things are fair use or not risky or probably out of copyright. And so maybe with having all these wonderful archival films that could be released, but otherwise, because of some unknown possible person out there, that the economic value of keeping them out there will allow some lawyer to review it and say, you know, it's not so risky and maybe we can get them out there, because there'd be so much lost without it. And that was really the basis for having orphan works legislation. It's not, you're not losing things. The purpose of copyright is really to increase the, you know, what we have in our culture and not keep things locked up because you don't know who owns it, because people are afraid of being sued.
If you can just talk briefly about the right of what did I call it again? Termination.
Okay.
Thank you, because I want to try to get to questions as quickly as possible.
Yeah, okay. Right of termination. So the Copyright Act, the old act and the new act, has a right of termination, and I'll really talk about the termination under the 1978 Act. That's Section 203. So the whole concept of termination is that when you're sort of starting out in your career, or maybe your first book or your record, is that you may not have the same bargaining power you have when you're more established. So what it does, it gives you an opportunity to terminate a grant of rights, and the nitty-gritty of it will like make you poke your eyes out. But it's essentially around, around 35 years. There's this window when you can start giving notice that you want to terminate. And then you have to give termination notices to all the appropriate parties, and then you get your rights back, and only your U.S. rights, and then you can renegotiate. The problem is that it doesn't apply if your grant of rights was done under a work for hire. And that's why it's been easier, and because of this 35 years, and it's been from 78, you're seeing a lot of termination cases now, and there's starting to be some new case law because authors of books can terminate because they write in their own name. You know, a lot of the bands that had the famous, you know, albums from the 70s and 80s can start to terminate in the music world. But in the film world, so many people use these loan-out companies where you were an employee and work for hire for your own company, and that completely screws you because then it's work for hire. And so all these great tax advice you got for how you should protect yourself from liability by making yourself a company, you now don't get the right of termination. So it's really unfortunate because they were thinking, it's an unintended consequence, because at that time work for hire was thought of as big corporations get work for hire and individuals are authors. But over time, there's been so much advice for individual photographers and filmmakers all to become, work with an entity. That way it's easier to deduct things from your tax returns. And unfortunately, the Copyright Act wasn't written with that in mind. And so it's really a problem.
I have no idea whether this will bear any fruit or not, but I do know a filmmaker who's decided to pursue this to try to crack through the work for hire thing by making the claim that because the filmmaker, in this case it's a fiction film, but making the case that the filmmaker wrote it, directed it, always had it in their possession until the thing was created as a work for hire, that they should be able to pierce through that as the true author of the film. And if that case does go forward and actually gets heard, that would be a huge thing.
Yeah, that would be. The thing is, litigation is very expensive and
slow. Yeah.
And slow,
Yeah.
and it takes a very long time, and they're just developing cases on this. The test at one time before 78 was if it was done at instance and expense. And now Work for Hire has this whole test about, sort of attributes of being an employee, employer. And they'll look at your tax returns. So that's.
All right, we should
Yeah.
do questions now because time is.
Yeah,
short.
let's
Okay,
do
let's do it.
questions.
Let's do it. Okay, so we have a question back there. First
Make
hand
everyone
up.
run.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was a DP and a producer on one of the films from your lost clips at the beginning. It's In Transit, Albert Maysles' final film, which cannot be seen. I also worked with Shola and Albert once on a crazy shoot that also was never released. That's an even deeper cut. But that was commissioned by Al Jazeera America, which no longer exists. So once the company exists, the rights revert back to Al Jazeera, the parent company, and it never got released. So I'm curious more about like a clause in a contract with any distributor that says if your company goes out of business, I get my rights back. You're saying that's unenforceable. I'd like to hear more about that or any other suggestions like keep your VOD rights and do it yourself so that when your contract ends in 5 years, you don't have to like re-deal with all the, VOD people who are exhibiting your film and like make a new contract and stuff like that. So thoughts on that?
Well, I would say that pretty much every permutation of what you just described has been tried, is being tried, will be tried. Okay, any way that people, filmmakers have to. I mean, the whole thing about non-enforceability is really about a bankruptcy situation because it's considered an asset of the company that that owns the rights. So I think there might be a way where when you license it in the first place, that you are not granting certain rights, and it's a very limited license. Okay, you might be able to have something like that be enforceable, but of course that would then only work when you were licensing rights that were very specific. So a lot of films get licensed by all distribution rights exclusively for a certain amount of time, and those are the hardest kinds of agreements to put that to put language into that allows you to keep that. I mean, when we were talking about allowing the filmmaker to not exclusively show the film, I've seen that. I've even seen, I haven't seen it lately, but where the filmmaker is allowed to actually sell DVDs of the film on their own website, okay? And there's a split.
But now they're not making DVD players anymore.
Well, that's true. Okay, so I guess that's over.
You can sometimes negotiate the right to sell a digital
copy.
Thank you. A digital copy from your own website. Yeah, similar,
Right.
which is an outgrowth of the DVD model.
So that would be the thing, I think that would be closest to what we're talking about.
But I think the most important thing as you're working on your own films is to ask and to be aggressive about it. And if somebody's not going to pay you a lot of money, then to cap the length of the distribution agreement and, put the timer in your phone. Scan that contract to the cloud, you know what I mean? Keep a backup copy, because we do have more power. And really, it starts with just asking.
Other questions? Yep, over there.
So in the case of a licensed film to a distributor, a major distributor, and the clock is ticking, and let's say a year or two out, you're either getting your rights back, maybe they have an option to extend it, depending on recoup. When would be the right time to start talking to them about it? Not wait till it expires. How do you approach them to see if they want to execute that option? Maybe you want the film back. How much, a year before or less, or?
I'm not sure that, I don't know, and someone else has an
I don't think there's a
answer.
formula.
I don't think there is either. It's a totally commercial situation.
Right.
It's like, is there a market for that film elsewhere? If there is, then, sort of the moment that is best to go is the moment that's going to get you the most money from someplace else, Right. I've seen contracts that have time periods built in on options that say that they have to be discussed or entered into within 60 days or 90 days of the end of the expiration period, and if they haven't given you notice by that time, then they're not picking up the option, stuff like that. Okay, so, that's something that you can do ahead of time when you're negotiating the deal in the first place, is to put some parameters around when the negotiation would happen. But I don't think there's otherwise a customary way to do it.
Yeah, I would say more time would be preferable because most companies move very slowly.
Right.
Questions? Yep.
So how would a first-time filmmaker make sure they have the legal expertise needed to have their ducks in a row for these contracts with a limited budget? How does it work working with?
These guys can be hired.
Ira, hold on a second. Did you all hear the question in the back?
No.
Can you repeat the question, Ira?
Are we good or not?
So, thank you. The question is, how does a first-time filmmaker with a limited budget make sure to have the legal expertise they need to make the best contracts when they are starting to do these deals?
This little flyer here.
There it is. That's it. That's the answer. There's no simple answer to that, but I mean, the kinds of things that we're talking about here today are partially in hopes of educating young filmmakers about that. The idea of doing a legal referrals kind of service. There is already an organization, which we probably know, which we're actually going to become part of, which is VLA, Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts, that you can apply to get legal help if you qualify. You have to be pretty poor, but that's somewhat relative. But there are information. I don't happen to have it at my fingertips. There are some books that are good and so forth and so on. And there are clinics. Cardozo Law School has a clinic that is, where I think they take on some clients to help them with that kind of stuff. But I mean, I know that with my clients, when they were first starting out, people that they knew who had more experience would give them their distribution contracts to read, to get educated about it.
Are there any books?
Yeah, there's lots of books, right?
But there are people. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, you first.
I was gonna say, but there are people, and
Right.
I have always been surprised. Like, if there's a lawyer you really like, they work with filmmakers you just want to be one day, reach out, because sometimes they do not pro bono, but they have like a sliding scale, and if they love what you're doing, they'll help you out. I early on with the Chisholm film was grants all the way. Little grants got bigger grants, and one of the kind of like around $50,000 or $75,000 grant, I was like, yeah, I don't really need a lawyer, and I signed it, and then I got a lawyer afterwards, and I really hurt myself when it came to sales because I didn't understand the consequences of some of the language. Having a lawyer is not a luxury. It's a necessity.
It's a famous John Bon Jovi story about how he walked in. I don't know if you remember, it's Clive Davis. I don't remember who the mogul was, but to sign him, and usually give him the contract, then they take it home and they have lawyers and all that stuff, and so he just sat there and signed it. And I think that tried many years to get out of it, but so that's it's not an uncommon problem for people to have. Hopefully hopefully you're not in a situation where someone hands you a 100-page contract and expects that you're going to just sign on the dotted line.
Yeah, as everyone's saying, it's very, very important to have a lawyer to guide you. I would also point you to an online site called Distribution Advocates. And Distribution Advocates was started by Karen Chen, Amy Hobby, and Avril Speaks in 2020, and they have a beautiful checklist that everyone should read. It's sort of like an anatomy of distribution, as I like to think of it. Yeah, and they have they describe what a digital distributor is versus an aggregator. What you can expect of a sales rep, how long a term you should have, how much the commission or sales fee should be. So it's distribution advocates, and it's a Substack, free, available to everyone, and just they have a newsletter as well. So I highly recommend checking them out.
I think I
Here's
saw.
time for one more.
Okay, one more. I thought I saw a hand somewhere in there.
Yeah, there's a guy right there waving.
I can't see him. Oh yeah, there he is. Okay.
The blinding light there.
Yeah.
Now this is slightly adjacent in terms of once you do get your rights back, which I just have on a blue chip documentary, I'm wondering if you had advice on who's actually interested in a film from 10 years ago. And well, you know, it seems like sales agents and a lot of distributors don't have the time to look at that kind of thing.
Well, what?
I would say, I mean, we could probably name companies, but I think one of the things that is usually helpful is go to look at films watch films that you think are comparable and see who the distributors are. Okay, because they'll be credited at the beginning of the film or the end of the film. They'll say such and such release, and you know if you don't even have to watch the whole film, but look at films that you think might be distributed by a company that might be interested in your movie, and you can compile that way a list, because it changes, as you can see from what we're saying. I mean, every few years it's a different little group of people, but there's and there are certainly specialists too, in educational companies and companies that specialize in certain kinds of films. That I think that would be, to me, that would be the easiest way to kind of come up with a list.